His fiancée forced the maid to eat from a broken plate, until the billionaire walked in. "Get down on the floor and eat what's on that plate, Elena. Every guest at this table is waiting." The words landed in the dining room like a stone dropped into still water. 12 people sat around the long mahogany table, their wine glasses half raised, their forks frozen an inch above their plates. The plate in question, the one Elena Reyes now knelt beside on the polished hardwood, had been perfect 3 minutes earlier. Now it lay in 3 jagged pieces, a smear of roasted duck and fig sauce spreading across the floor like a wound. Elena had not dropped it. She knew that. Vanessa Cole knew that too, because Vanessa was the one who had knocked it from her hands on the way to the sideboard, tipping it with 2 fingers so smoothly that half the table assumed it was an accident, and the other half assumed nothing at all, because they had learned over the last few weeks not to look too closely at anything that happened between Vanessa and the new housekeeper. "I said kneel," Vanessa said again, and smiled the way she always smiled when she wanted something ugly to look like discipline. "You broke it. You lead off it. That's how we teach people to be careful." Elena's knees found the floor. She was 29 years old, and she had scrubbed floors, ironed linens, and swallowed her pride in more houses than she could count on both hands, and she had promised herself, after the last time her dignity had been taken from her by a woman not so different from this one, that she would never again let anyone see her break. So she did not cry. She looked down at the shards, at the sauce cooling into a dark pool, and her hands, steady, calloused, the hands of a woman who had once restored 200-year-old furniture for a living before life narrowed her choices down to this, did not shake. She looked up once, past Vanessa's satisfied smile, past the candlelight trembling on the crystal, toward the front hall, where the tall oak doors stood closed against the cold October evening. In a few minutes those doors would open. And when they did, everything Vanessa Cole had spent 8 years building would come apart in front of the very people she'd invited to watch her win. But Elena didn't know that yet. All she knew, kneeling on the floor of a house that wasn't hers, was that she had 3 months ago walked through those same doors for the first time, certain this job was simply a fresh start. She had been wrong about that. It was never going to be simple. Before we get to how that dinner ended, I want to say a quick thank you for spending this time with us. This channel exists for stories about the people who get overlooked, the ones who show up, do the work, and hold on to their dignity even when nobody else seems to notice. If that's the kind of story you come here for, hit subscribe because we've got a lot more of them. Now, let's go back to where this really started, 3 months before that dinner, when Elena Reyes walked up the front steps of the Hart estate for the first time, holding a single suitcase and a letter of reference she'd fought 2 years to earn back. Elena had grown up in a small house outside Providence, the daughter of a furniture restorer who taught her, before she was 10 years old, how to read the grain of old with the way other children read picture books. She could tell you by smell alone whether a table had been finished with shellac or lacquer. She could set a broken chair leg so cleanly you'd never find the seam. By 22, she was apprenticing at a small conservation studio in Newport, repairing pieces for museums and old New England families who still had grandfather clocks worth more than most people's cars. Then, at 24, everything she'd built had been taken from her in a single afternoon, by a woman she'd once considered a friend. Elena didn't like to think about those years much. She'd survived them by working with her hands in other people's houses, cleaning instead of restoring, dusting other families' heirlooms instead of repairing her own life, and by telling herself over and over that someday the truth would find its way back to the surface, the way water always does. She hadn't expected that day to come at the Hart estate. She'd taken the job because Rosa Alvarez, the house manager, had a reputation for treating her staff like people instead of furniture, and because the pay would finally let Elena start saving toward reopening a small workshop of her own. The main house sat on 11 acres of Connecticut shoreline, an old shingle-style mansion that Julian Hart's grandfather had built and that Julian, now 34 and running the family's real estate and technology holdings, had inherited 3 years earlier along with his father's chair on 4 different boards and, more quietly, his mother's declining health. Elena met Julian only once in her first week, in the hallway outside his late father's study, where she was polishing an antique barometer that hadn't worked properly in a decade. He'd stopped, startled that anyone had noticed it, and asked what she thought was wrong with it. She told him the mercury seal had failed, nothing dramatic, an easy fix if you knew what you were looking at. And he'd looked at her for a moment too long, the way people do when they realize someone has quietly seen something no one else bothered to see. "You know about barometers?" he asked. "I know about old things," she said. "People stop looking at what's actually there. They just see broken and give up." He didn't say much else. He thanked her, told her to fix it if she wanted to, and went back into his study, already reading something on his phone, the weight of the company visibly sitting on him even in his own hallway. Elena didn't think about the exchange again until much later, when it would matter more than either of them could have guessed. Julian's mother, Eleanor Hart, was a different kind of presence in the house. Sharp-eyed despite a heart condition that kept her mostly confined to the East Wing, and unfailingly kind to the staff in a way that had nothing to do with performance. She liked Elena immediately, in the plain, unsentimental way older women sometimes recognize competence in younger ones. Within 2 weeks, Elena was bringing her afternoon tea and reading to her when her eyes tired, and Eleanor had started calling her the quiet one who actually listens, which from Eleanor was closer to a medal than a nickname. And then there was Vanessa. Elena met her on the 4th day, in the flower room off the kitchen, where Vanessa had come to inspect the centerpieces for a dinner 3 weeks out. She was 30 years old, dressed in the kind of effortless cream cashmere that costs more than most people's rent, with a smile that arrived a half-second before her eyes did. Rosa introduced them. Vanessa's hand, when she offered it, was cool and light. "Elena," Vanessa repeated, testing the name like it might mean something. "Have we met before?" "I don't think so," Elena said, and meant it, because in that moment, looking at Vanessa's styled blonde hair and sculpted cheekbones and the confident tilt of her chin, she genuinely did not recognize the woman standing in front of her. But something in Vanessa's face had gone tight for half a second before smoothing back into its practiced ease, and Elena, who had spent years learning to read the fine grain of things other people missed, filed that half-second away without quite knowing why. The first real crack in the house's calm surface came 10 days later, over something as small as a set of silver candlesticks. Vanessa had them polished for a dinner party and declared, the next morning, that Elena had left water spots on them, an accusation delivered in front of 2 other staff members and worse, in front of Rosa. Elena hadn't touched the candlesticks in 3 days. She said so, calmly, and Vanessa's smile thinned into something colder. "Are you calling me a liar?" Vanessa asked, in a voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "No," Elena said. "I'm telling you I didn't do it." Should have ended there. Instead, Vanessa assigned her to repolish every piece of silver in the house, twice, and made a point of walking through the servants' pantry at midnight to check the work, standing in the doorway in her silk robe with her arms crossed, watching Elena's hands move over metal she had already cleaned to a mirror shine. Elena didn't understand it yet, not really. She told herself it was simply what some people were like when they married into money, a need to prove to themselves as much as to anyone else that they had the power to make someone else's life harder. She had met women like that before. She reminded herself that she needed this job, that she was rebuilding something, and that the smartest thing she could do was keep her head down and let the ugliness roll past her like weather. What she didn't know was that Vanessa wasn't testing her loyalty. Vanessa was testing whether Elena recognized her. Because alone in her enormous dressing room that night, after the candlesticks were done, Vanessa sat at her mirror and stared at her own reflection for a long time, one hand pressed flat against her collarbone as though she could physically hold something in place. On the vanity in front of her sat a small blue velvet box, and inside it, resting on white satin, a sapphire brooch shaped like a curled fern frond, its stones dark as a bruise. "She wouldn't dare," Vanessa whispered to no one. "She doesn't even remember me." She said it like she was trying to convince herself. She did not sound convinced. The second time Elena felt that same strange chill of half-recognition. It was at Eleanor's request. Elena had been asked to help set up a small photo album Eleanor kept of old family gatherings. One Vanessa had wanted photographed for the wedding website, and Vanessa had come to collect it in person, standing in the doorway of Eleanor's sitting room with her phone already out. "You have a habit," Elena said without thinking as Vanessa reached for the album. "Touching your left ear when you're annoyed. Someone I used to work with did the exact same thing." She hadn't meant it as anything but small talk. But Vanessa's hand dropped from her ear like it had been burned, and for one unguarded second, her eyes weren't the composed, camera-ready eyes of Vanessa Cole. They were the eyes of someone doing rapid math on how much danger she was in. "That's not a habit of mine," Vanessa said too quickly and took the album and left. Elena stood there for a moment in the quiet room, an odd unease settling into her chest, the feeling of a puzzle piece sliding half an inch closer to fitting without yet showing her the whole picture. She didn't chase the thought. She had learned the hard way not to accuse anyone of anything without proof, because the last time she trusted her instincts about a woman like this, it had cost her everything. She didn't yet know that this house held the second half of that old story. 2 weeks later, at Eleanor's insistence, Vanessa wore the sapphire brooch to a small family dinner. "A Cole family heirloom," she told the table, touching it fondly. "My grandmother's from Newport." Elena, carrying in the soup, glanced at it in passing and felt something drop through her stomach like a missed stare. She knew that brooch. She had dusted its glass display case 100 times years ago, in a house 200 miles from here, in a room that belonged to a woman named Margaret Ashford. She didn't say anything. She kept walking, set down the soup, and went back to the kitchen, where she stood at the sink for a full minute with her hands flat on the cold steel, breathing. It couldn't be. Vanessa Cole had grown up in Newport, everyone said so. Her family had money. There were photographs of a stately Cole family home in magazine spreads about the engagement. Yet, Elena didn't sleep well that night. She tried once to find out for certain, carefully, the way you'd test ice before putting your full weight on it. A week later, setting the table for a smaller lunch, she mentioned, as casually as she could manage, that she'd once worked in Rhode Island, at an estate near the water, for an elderly woman who collected antique jewelry. Vanessa's hands, arranging place cards, went very still. "Is that right?" Vanessa said, not looking up. "Mrs. Ashford," Elena said. "Margaret Ashford. She passed a few years back. Lovely woman. Terrible staff turnover, though. There was some kind of scandal before I left. A member of her household staff accused of theft." The silence that followed was only 2 seconds long, but Elena felt every part of it. "I don't know anyone by that name," Vanessa said, and her voice had gone flat and precise in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "I think you should focus on the table settings, Elena. The Hendersons are particular about their forks." It wasn't proof. Elena knew that. A flinch and a cold response weren't a confession. But that afternoon, Vanessa complained to Rosa that Elena had been inserting herself into personal conversations and making guests uncomfortable, and by evening, Elena had been reassigned from serving family meals to laundry and linens, a demotion dressed up as a scheduling adjustment. Elena said nothing. She folded sheets in the basement laundry room and told herself that this, at least, was a smaller injustice than the one that had already broken her life open once before. She had survived worse. She would survive this too, as long as she kept quiet and kept her job. What she didn't yet understand was that keeping quiet wasn't going to be enough. Vanessa had decided, somewhere in that cold 2-second silence, that Elena Reyes could not be allowed to stay in this house until the wedding. The only question left was how to make her leave without anyone asking why. The plan Vanessa settled on was patient, and it was cruel in the particular way that only feels cruel once you understand what's driving it. It started with small missing things. A pair of cufflinks that turned up a week later, found in the laundry room where Elena worked, though Elena had never touched them. A charge on a household credit card that Vanessa claimed in front of Rosa and eventually in front of Julian had been authorized by someone in the staff without permission. Someone whose access happened to line up conveniently with Elena's schedule. Elena felt the walls of the house closing in around her, one polite conversation at a time. Rosa, to her credit, didn't believe the accusations outright, but she also couldn't ignore them, not with Vanessa pressing so consistently and so calmly. Elena tried to defend herself the way any innocent person does, plainly, without theatrics, expecting the truth to be self-evident. It wasn't. Innocent people rarely sound as convincing as guilty people who've had time to rehearse. The worst moment came on a Tuesday afternoon, when Julian called Elena into his study, the same room with a barometer she'd fixed weeks earlier, now ticking quietly and accurately on the wall behind him. "Vanessa tells me there've been some issues," he said. He looked tired, in the particular way of a man juggling 4 business crises and a wedding he didn't have time to plan. "Missing items. A card charge nobody can account for." "I didn't take anything, Mr. Hart," Elena said. "And I've never touched that card." "I believe you're saying that," he said, which wasn't the same as "I believe you," and both of them knew it. "But I have to be careful. This house runs on trust, and right now there's a question mark where there shouldn't be one." Elena wanted badly to tell him everything. The brooch, the flinch, the name Ashford, the 2 seconds of silence that had told her more than any confession could. But she had no proof. She had a memory and a feeling, and she had learned at 24 exactly what happens to a woman who accuses someone powerful of something ugly with nothing to back it up. She had lost her career that way. She wasn't going to lose what little she had left the same way twice. So she said only, "I understand," and left his study with her hands steady and her stomach in knots, and that night, for the first time since she'd arrived, she thought seriously about quitting before anyone could force her out. She didn't quit that week. Instead, something quieter happened, the kind of thing the loud parts of a story sometimes miss. Eleanor Hart, who had grown fond of the young woman who read to her in the afternoons and never once complained about the smell of her medicine or the slowness of her hands, noticed that Elena had stopped coming as often, and asked Rosa why. "She's been reassigned, ma'am," Rosa said carefully. "Some concerns about missing items." "Concerns from whom?" Eleanor asked, in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman who had outlived 3 business partners and 1 husband's worth of nonsense and had very little patience left for it. "Miss Cole, ma'am." Eleanor said nothing to that, but the next time Elena brought her tea, because Eleanor had specifically requested her, overruling the new schedule with the ease of someone who still owned 40% of the company on paper, she studied Elena's face for a long moment. "You didn't take anything," Eleanor said. "It wasn't a question." "No, ma'am. I didn't think so." Eleanor took her tea, sipped it, and looked out at the gray water beyond the window. "I've buried a husband and outlived 2 business partners who thought they were smarter than me, Elena. I know what a guilty face looks like. Yours isn't it?" He paused. "Vanessa's, on the other hand, I've never quite been able to read. That used to bother me. Lately it worries me." She said nothing more that day. But it was the first time since the candlesticks that Elena felt like someone in that house was actually looking at her, rather than through her. That same week, sorting through an old box of her own belongings she'd never fully unpacked since moving 3 cities in 3 years, Elena found the photograph. Small, slightly bent at one corner, taken at the Ashford Estate staff holiday party 6 years earlier. 2 young women stood side by side in matching black uniforms, laughing at something outside the frame. One of them was Elena, 23 years old and a little thinner. The other had different hair, softer edges to her face, no sculpted cheekbones yet, but the eyes were unmistakable, once Elena let herself really look. Nadia Voss, who'd started at the Ashford house 4 months before Elena, who used to sneak extra desserts up to her room and complain about her feet, who had, without a shred of hesitation, told Mrs. Ashford's lawyer that she'd seen Elena near the jewelry cabinet the week the sapphire brooch and 2 other pieces went missing. A lie so smooth and so confident that Elena, then 24, blacklisted and humiliated and unable to prove otherwise, had spent 2 years rebuilding a reputation from nothing. Elena sat on the floor of her small rented room with the photograph in her hands for a long time. She didn't cry. She had done all her crying about this 6 years ago. What she felt instead was something colder and steadier, the particular calm of finally understanding a shape she'd only been able to feel in the dark. She put the photograph in the drawer of her nightstand and did not tell anyone yet. She wasn't sure at that point what telling anyone would even accomplish. Nadia had become Vanessa Cole, engaged to one of the wealthiest men on the eastern seaboard, wearing a brooch that had once belonged to the very woman she'd framed Elena for stealing from. Who, exactly, was going to believe the housekeeper over that? Vanessa, for her part, had noticed the shift too. She noticed the way Eleanor had quietly rerouted Elena back into her afternoons. She noticed the particular stillness in Elena's face whenever they crossed paths now. Not fear, which was what she wanted, but something closer to certainty, which frightened her far more. She decided the wedding needed to move faster. She told Julian over dinner one night that she didn't want a long engagement. Life was short. His mother's health was fragile. Why wait a year when they could be married in 6 weeks, small and elegant, just close friends and family? Julian, exhausted and in love with the idea of simplicity, even if he wasn't entirely sure about the woman offering it, agreed. She also began carefully to raise the subject of finances, a joint account for wedding expenses. A modest transfer that would be easier, she said, than constantly running receipts past his assistant. Julian's oldest friend and personal attorney, a sharp, unsentimental man named Marcus Webb, flagged it gently in a phone call. "Nothing urgent," Marcus said. "Just, maybe wait until after the wedding for that particular convenience." Julian agreed, distracted, already thinking about a board meeting in an hour, and didn't think much more about it. But the seed of doubt Marcus had planted sat in the back of Julian's mind the way small doubts do, not loud enough to act on, but present enough to notice later when it mattered. Meanwhile, the campaign against Elena sharpened. Vanessa complained that Elena was insubordinate. She complained that Elena stared at her. She engineered a small, humiliating incident at a luncheon where Elena was made to apologize, in front of 6 guests, for a stain on a tablecloth that had, in fact, been there before the meal started. Elena apologized. She had learned, over the years, which battles were worth losing on purpose in order to survive the war. But something in her had also, quietly, stopped bending. She wasn't 24 anymore. She had already lost everything once to this woman and rebuilt a life out of nothing. She was not going to disappear from this house without at least making Vanessa work for it. The lowest point came on a rainy Thursday, 9 days before the dinner that would end everything. Elena had been assigned, without explanation, to the smallest and coldest room in the servants' wing, a demotion in every way but title. She'd overheard 2 of the other staff in the kitchen murmuring about whatever she did, their voices careful not to be unkind but unmistakably distant, the particular loneliness of being quietly excluded by people who don't actually know the truth and have decided it's safer not to ask. That evening, Elena sat on the edge of her narrow bed with a half-packed bag in front of her. She had decided, finally, that she would give her notice in the morning. Not because she was guilty of anything. She knew, with total certainty, exactly who she was and exactly what Vanessa Cole had done, both 6 years ago and in the weeks since. But she was tired of being made small in rooms where the truth didn't seem to matter, and she had learned that sometimes the most dignified thing a person can do is leave on their own terms before someone else forces the door shut on them. She thought of the photograph in her nightstand drawer. She almost threw it away that night. What good was proof if no one with power was willing to look at it? Instead, on impulse, she brought Eleanor her evening tea one last time, thinking she owed the old woman that much of a goodbye, even unspoken. Eleanor studied her face over the rim of her cup. "You're leaving," she said. Not a question again. "I think it's best," Elena said. "Because of Vanessa?" Elena didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. Eleanor set down her tea. "I knew a family in Newport once," she said slowly, watching Elena's face the way she watched stock charts, for the smallest, most honest movement. "The Ashfords. Margaret and I served on a hospital board together years ago. There was some unpleasantness in her house before she passed. Jewelry that went missing, a young woman let go under a cloud, though Margaret always seemed unsettled about it afterward, like she thought they might have gotten the wrong girl. She never did find the truth before she died." Eleanor's eyes didn't leave Elena's face. "I only remembered it because you mentioned the name Ashford to Vanessa a few weeks back at that lunch. I happened to be in the next room." Vanessa's response struck me as considerably colder than a woman discussing a name she'd never heard before. The room went very quiet, though not in the way rooms usually do in these stories. It was a careful quiet, the kind that happens when two people are deciding at the same moment whether to trust each other with something dangerous. Elena went to her room and came back with the photograph. Eleanor looked at it for a long time. Then she looked up. "Does my son know any of this?" "No," Elena said. "I didn't think anyone would believe me over her." "I believe you," Eleanor said simply. "The question now is how we make sure Julian sees it too, before he marries a woman who's already lied to him about who she is." He paused. "Don't leave yet, Elena. Not until we've finished this properly. You've already lost one fight to this woman without a chance to defend yourself. You're not losing a second one the same way." Eleanor didn't tell Julian directly. Not yet. She knew her son, and she knew that an accusation delivered secondhand, without proof strong enough to survive Vanessa's denial, would simply become another he said. She said that Vanessa would win through sheer performance. Instead, quietly, Eleanor called Marcus Webb the next morning and asked him, as a personal favor, to look a little more carefully into the Cole family background before the wedding. "Not because I distrust my son's judgment," she told him, "but because I distrust a woman who flinches at the mention of Rhode Island." Marcus, who already had his own small reservations after the joint account conversation, agreed. It took him 4 days to find what he needed. No record of a Cole family estate in Newport matching Vanessa's stated childhood address. A name change filed 8 years earlier, from Nadia Voss to Vanessa Cole, shortly after a quiet, undocumented departure from employment at the Ashford estate in Rhode Island, and buried in an old local news archive. A brief mention of jewelry reported missing from the Ashford home the same season, with no arrest ever made and no resolution ever printed. Marcus called Julian on a Tuesday afternoon, the day before the dinner party Vanessa had been planning for weeks. A small engagement celebration for close friends, family, and a handful of Julian's most important business partners, including Diane Corwin, an old friend of the Hart family and, as it happened, someone who had known Margaret Ashford personally for over 20 years. "I need 15 minutes, Marcus said. "In person. It's about Vanessa." Julian, sitting in his study with the barometer ticking steadily behind him, felt something cold settle low in his stomach. Not shock exactly, more like the specific unease of a man realizing that a doubt he'd been quietly ignoring for weeks had just grown teeth. "Tomorrow's not a good time," Julian said slowly. "We have the dinner." "I know," Marcus said. "I think you need to hear this before it happens, not after." The dinner began exactly as Vanessa had planned it. Candlelight, string quartet in the next room, 12 guests in evening clothes, Eleanor seated at the head of the table in her wheelchair, dignified and watchful. Julian arrived late from a call with Marcus that had left him quiet and distracted, sliding into his seat with an apology and a look Vanessa couldn't quite read. Elena had been assigned to serve that night. Not by Vanessa's choice, but because 2 other staff members were out sick and Rosa, who had grown increasingly uneasy about the whole situation, hadn't wanted to leave Elena alone downstairs with nothing to do but wait for whatever came next. It was near the second course that Vanessa made her move. She had been waiting for an opening all evening, some way to force Elena's exit in front of witnesses who would remember it as discipline rather than cruelty. A plan that had been forming since the moment she realized Elena wasn't going to quietly disappear on her own. When Elena approached with a tray of plated duck, Vanessa reached out, under the pretense of adjusting a serving dish, and tipped the plate from Elena's hands with 2 practiced fingers. It shattered against the floor in 3 jagged pieces. "You broke it," Vanessa said, her voice pitched for the whole table, disappointment dressing up as patience. "That's the 2nd time this month." It wasn't. It was the first time in Elena's life anyone had broken a plate for her on purpose and then blamed her for it, but she understood in that moment exactly what was happening and exactly why. This was the final push. Vanessa needed her gone tonight, in front of enough people that no one would ever question the story afterward. "Get down on the floor and eat what's on that plate, Elena," Vanessa said. "Every guest at this table is waiting." Some of the guests shifted, uncomfortable, glancing at each other, unsure whether this was some strange joke that hadn't landed. Eleanor's hand tightened on the arm of her wheelchair. Julian, still absorbing what Marcus had told him an hour earlier, opened his mouth to object, but Elena was already lowering herself to her knees, because she had decided, somewhere in the last 9 days, exactly how this moment was going to end, and it wasn't going to end with her running. She knelt beside the broken plate. She looked at the shattered porcelain and the cooling sauce, and she did not reach for it. "No," she said, quietly but clearly enough for the whole table to hear. Vanessa's smile flickered. "Excuse me. I said no," Elena said, rising back to her feet, meeting Vanessa's eyes without flinching for the first time since she'd arrived at this house. "I won't do it. Not for you. Not again." "Again," Vanessa repeated, and there was something underneath the word now, something brittle. "You did this to me once already," Elena said. 6 years ago. Except that time you didn't need a broken plate. You just needed a lie, and a lawyer who believed you over me." She reached into her apron pocket and set the photograph on the white tablecloth, between the candlesticks Vanessa had once accused her of ruining. "Hello, Nadia." The dining room did not go silent exactly. It went very, very still, the particular stillness of 12 people simultaneously recalculating everything they thought they understood about the evening. It was Diane Corwin, seated near the far end of the table, who broke it. She leaned forward, adjusting her glasses, staring at the brooch pinned to Vanessa's shoulder with an expression of dawning, disbelieving recognition. "That's the Ashford fern brooch," she said slowly. "I'd know it anywhere. Margaret wore it to my daughter's wedding. She always wondered what happened to it after that whole business with the missing jewelry. She went to her grave never quite believing the girl they blamed had actually done it." Diane looked from the brooch to Vanessa's face, and then more slowly to Elena. "Good Lord. It was you, wasn't it? The girl in the photograph. You worked for Margaret." "I did," Elena said. "For 2 years. Until Nadia Voss told Margaret's lawyer she saw me near the jewelry cabinet the week that brooch disappeared. I was blacklisted. It took me 2 years to find steady work again." She looked at Vanessa, whose face had gone through 3 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds, none of them the smooth, camera-ready ease she usually wore like armor. "I never stole anything in my life. You knew that. You knew it the whole time." Julian had stood up at some point during this without quite realizing he'd done it. He looked at Vanessa, really looked at her, the way you look at someone once you've stopped assuming the best about them, and then at the brooch, and then at Marcus, who was watching from his own seat near the door with the particular grim patience of a man who had tried to warn his friend a day too late to spare him the public version of this. "Vanessa," Julian said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in a way that shattered whatever composure she had left. "Is your name Nadia Voss?" For a moment, it looked like she might deny it, might reach for the practiced smoothness that had carried her through 8 years of reinvention. But there were too many eyes on her now, too many pieces already on the table, and even Vanessa Cole, who had built an entire second life on the strength of her own certainty, couldn't out-talk a photograph, a brooch, and a family friend who'd known the real story for 20 years. "It doesn't matter what my name used to be," she said, her voice thin now, stripped of its usual polish. I didn't do anything you weren't going to give me anyway. You have more money than you know what to do with, Julian. I just wanted a life. Is that such a crime? You framed an innocent woman for theft, Eleanor said from the head of the table, her voice cutting clean through the room. You've spent 3 months trying to destroy her a second time because she recognized you. And you tried to talk my son into merging his finances with yours 6 weeks before the wedding. She looked at Vanessa with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, something closer to disappointment, the particular disappointment of someone who had genuinely hoped to be wrong. That's not wanting a life, dear. That's building one out of other people's ruins. Julian didn't raise his voice. That was, in some ways, worse for Vanessa than shouting would have been. I need you to leave tonight, he said. I'll have your things sent wherever you'd like. The wedding is off. And I think, he added, glancing once at Diane Corwin, whose expression had gone thoughtful and hard, you should consider whether Margaret Ashford's estate might have some interest in that brooch. Vanessa looked around the table once, at the guests who would talk about this for months, at Eleanor's unwavering gaze, at Julian's quiet, immovable calm, at Elena standing straight-backed by the wreckage of a plate she had refused, finally, to kneel for, and understood with total clarity that there was no version of the rest of this evening that ended in her favor. She stood, unpinned the brooch from her shoulder with fingers that weren't quite steady, set it on the tablecloth beside the photograph, and left the room without another word. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The days after the dinner were quieter than anyone expected, in the way that a house is always quieter after a storm has finally passed through it instead of just threatening to. Vanessa's belongings were packed and shipped within 48 hours. She did not contest the broken engagement, did not attempt to salvage what remained of her position in that particular social circle, and, after a brief tense phone call from Marcus Webb, who had located Margaret Ashford's surviving nephew and executor, quietly agreed to return the sapphire brooch rather than face a formal claim. Diane Corwin, true to her word, made sure the Ashford family finally had the piece of the truth Margaret had died without. Julian sat down with Elena 2 days later, in the same study where he'd once questioned her about missing cufflinks, and this time he didn't sit behind the desk. He sat across from her, in the chair usually reserved for guests, which Elena noticed and understood the meaning of before he said a word. I should have believed you the first time, he said. When Vanessa first brought the accusations to me, I told myself I was being careful. I was actually just being convenient for myself, because it was easier than questioning someone I'd already decided to trust. You didn't know, Elena said. I could have asked better questions, Julian said. I'm not going to pretend that not knowing makes it fair. What happened to you in this house? Or what happened before, at the Ashford estate? He paused. Marcus tracked down the domestic staffing registry that blacklisted you. It's a private industry list, not a legal record, but it still follows people around for years. I'd like his firm to help you clear it, formally, if you'll let us. Not as a favor. As something that should have happened 6 years ago and didn't, because nobody with any power in the room was willing to look past a well-dressed lie. Elena thought of the 2 years she'd spent rebuilding a reputation from nothing, the doors that had quietly closed on her without explanation, the version of herself, the antique restorer, the woman who could read the grain of old wood like a second language, that she'd set aside because survival didn't leave room for it. I'd like that, she said. Thank you. It took 6 weeks for Marcus's firm to fully unwind the old accusation, with a signed statement from Margaret Ashford's nephew and the recovered brooch as evidence enough to finally close the case the right way. Elena's name, after 6 years, was clean again, not just in this house, but on paper, in the registry that had once quietly ended her career without ever giving her the chance to defend herself. Eleanor Hart, who had never stopped believing Elena from the very first afternoon she watched her fix a barometer no one else had bothered to notice was broken, made her own kind of offer a few weeks after that. She had, tucked away in the estate's East Wing storage rooms, an entire collection of antique furniture, clocks, chairs, a writing desk that had belonged to Julian's great-grandmother, that had sat untouched and slowly deteriorating for over a decade, because no one in the family had known what to do with pieces that were broken in ways money alone couldn't fix. "I understand you used to do this kind of work," Eleanor said, gesturing at the dust-covered desk with its split leg and peeling veneer. "Before life got complicated." "I did," Elena said. "I'd like my grandmother's desk to be usable again before I die," Eleanor said, with the particular bluntness of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the last month, that she didn't have patience left for anything less than honesty. "I'd also like you to consider staying on here in a different capacity if you're willing, overseeing the household's collections, doing the restoration work yourself instead of dusting around it." Julian's agreed to fund a proper workshop on the property. "Call it overdue." Elena stood in that storage room for a long moment, surrounded by furniture that had been quietly falling apart for years because no one had taken the time to really look at it, and thought about how much of her own life had felt the same way before this house, before this family, before a broken plate had finally forced the truth to the surface where it couldn't be ignored anymore. "I'd like that very much," she said. It was almost 4 months later in early spring that Julian found her in the new workshop off the east wing, sleeves rolled up, carefully re-gluing the split leg of Eleanor's grandmother's writing desk with the same steady, unhurried hands that had once refused to reach for a broken plate on a dining room floor. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her work, the way he had that first week in the hallway with the barometer. "You were right," he said, "about people giving up on things too quickly, just because they look broken." Elena looked up, a faint smile crossing her face. Not performed, not careful, just real. "Most things aren't as broken as they look," she said. "You just have to actually take the time to see what's underneath." He didn't say anything else that day, not about the two of them, not yet. Some things he was learning deserved to be repaired slowly and honestly, the same way she repaired everything else. But he stayed a while longer than he needed to, watching her hands move over old wood. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the house felt like it was finally, quietly, becoming what it was always supposed to be. If you were sitting at that table the night Elena refused to kneel, would you have had the courage to do the same thing, knowing what it might cost you? I'd love to hear your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, and if you believe people who tell the truth deserve to be believed the first time, not the fifth, take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes dignity is worth fighting for, even when it's hardest to hold on to.